All right, hey there. Today is day 12 of our 31 Days of Horror, and today I checked out The Craft Legacy. I heard about this movie a few years ago. I wasn't necessarily all that interested because I'm not a huge fan of the fact that they just keep rebooting popular franchises or they keep trying to reboot B movies that have found, a lot of success. And The Craft was one of those movies that, preteen, teenage me was really into. Um, because I think if you talk to any female, almost every girl at some point has gone through a witchcraft phase. um, and it kind of just went right along with, I was a huge Buffy the Vampire Slayer fan, and Willow Rosenberg's kind of witchcraft arc, kind of plays into this whole, interest. So it's been quite a few years since this movie came out. I'm looking right now. It actually came out in 2020. Um, and I have to say that I was pleasantly surprised because this thing didn't have a lot going for it. It's a sequel to a kind of cult classic. And it's also a PG-13 horror movie, and both of those things usually don't make for a good film. But I have to say, honestly, they did a really, really good job with casting, with storytelling. I have to say that when I was first watching the movie, I was getting a little, um, I don't necessarily want to say concerned or annoyed, but it seemed like they were going in the direction of kind of trying to retell the original story with new cast members. And that gets a little bit irritating. I mean, we all know about, not we all, but if you've watched The Craft, then you know about how there are three girls who are good friends, and they try to practice witchcraft, but they're looking for their fourth because somebody has to represent each one of the elements and each one of the directions. And this movie starts the same. And there's a young girl who's relocating for some reason to a new town, and that also, follows the same trajectory. There's a boy at school who bullies her, and the girls kind of come together and to help her out. They realize she's the fourth, and then they start um, casting spells together. And there's a childhood kind of innocence about it. And I have to say, casting did an excellent job in this movie of casting uh, girls who seem like they would actually be in high school. And I think that's a really important thing because I'm pretty sure we all know that the majority of shows and things that we had growing up and a majority of movies, when they said it was a teenager, it was usually like a 35-year-old pretending they're in high school. Um, and I mean, you had that happen with the 90210 series and like Melrose Place. And then you had that with a lot of those movies that came out around that same time because the original Craft starred Robin Tunney, uh, Nev Campbell, Fairuza Balk, and all of them were, I believe, in their 20s when they were filming, pretending to be high school students. And when you're looking back on those movies, it's painfully obvious those are not high school students. Um, and it doesn't take any enjoyment away from the film, but there's some childlike innocence to the way that actual younger people deliver lines in their movies that I think adds a little bit to their vulnerability, especially if you're talking about horror. And I think they did a really great job of kind of setting you up to expect that this is going to go the same trajectory as the original Craft movie did. And then it kind of subverts all of those expectations and it turns itself into something new. And that made for a really enjoyable, movie experience. Was it the best movie I've ever seen? No. But if you are looking for a movie to watch with maybe a preteen girl, who wants to watch something for the spooky season, or, maybe a younger person who kind of wants to check out horror, but you're not quite sure, This actually would be a really good option. This is one of the few outings that I can say they did a good job with the PG-13 because they didn't do anything in the movie that needed to be dialed back in order to get that PG-13 rating. Um, and I think it's cool to kind of look at horror from that perspective because I'm also looking at it as I grew up watching horror. And the equivalent for me of being able to watch a lot of the movies that I did when I was young is that I used to watch them on cable TV. And they used to cut out, you know, the gory parts and they used to cut out the swearing. And so that's how I ended up seeing a lot of films when I was relatively young that might not have necessarily been appropriate for me. The newer generations don't really have that anymore because cable TV is not really a thing. Most people have kind of cut the cord, and even if they haven't, watching actual television isn't really something that the newer generations really gravitate to. It's not something that they grew up with where that's the only option, like we did. So you're not getting the edited movies on TV. The other thing too is a lot of the channels they don't edit movies anymore. They just tell you up front. They're like, "This is an R-rated movie. Watch it or don't." And, you know, there's been, you know, instances where, you know, somebody I know has been watching TV, it's been on in the background, and I'm sitting here going, like, man, are they, like, are you watching, like, HBO or something? And they're like, no, this is just whatever channel. And, you know, I have to sit there and go, oh, okay, that's a lot different than when I was a kid. That being said, there's nothing wrong with things changing. I just think the opportunities for younger people to kind of get into horror are not the best options all the time anymore. Because a lot of times it just means they're exposed to things they're not quite ready for. And I think films like this are a really great way to kind of experience a lot of those elements, to kind of get used to a lot of those elements, so that later on, when, you know, if you do enjoy the horror movie genre and you start watching things, you know, as younger people get older, they start watching things that are a little more in depth or a little more adult, then I don't think that they're going to have the negative experiences or the kind of, you know, trauma response to some things that some of us may have had by watching things a little bit too early. Um, Also, I loved the, you know, they did do, you know, some tie in to the original movie. I don't necessarily think it was necessary. I mean, necessarily necessary. I don't think it was needed. I think this movie stood well on its own, especially given the ambiguous nature of the characters' backgrounds in the original film. I think it would have been fine if we didn't get a tie-in to the original craft. But I do think that fans of the original might appreciate that little bit of fan service. And I don't think there's anything wrong with fan service, especially if you're doing a sequel to a movie that people really enjoyed and the sequel is coming years and years and years after the original, and it's not something that people were clamoring for. I think paying the original fans a little bit of fan service is definitely kind of the least you can do. Um, I'm not the biggest fan of reboots. I don't really think that they should be doing sequels or spiritual sequels or requels or whatever you want to call them. I kind of wish they would just stop and come up with some original ideas. And I've seen a lot of movies in the past where I can say they would have been a better movie if they didn't try to piggyback on the franchise that they're naming themselves after. I definitely have those feelings when it comes to the Scream franchise. It's one of my personal favorites. And I think after the original three, I don't necessarily think that going back to the franchise was a bad thing, but I do think that the way that they decided to do it was not preferable. And a lot of the movies I think would have been better as standalone movies. I think they would have stood better on their own 2 feet as sitting there and saying, we're going to do meta horror in the 2020s, as opposed to trying to tie back and trying to link back to the originals and piggybacking on that name. And I've seen that in a lot of ways. I feel the same way about the reboot of the Evil Dead franchise. The 2013 Evil Dead outing, I think, was atrocious, and I would just prefer to never discuss it. I think Evil Dead Rise was actually a very good movie. I enjoyed it a lot. I just think it would have been a whole lot better if they had called it something different instead of Evil Dead. Because let's face it, the Necronomicon is not exclusive to the Evil Dead. Demon Possession's not exclusive. And so you can do a lot of things with those stories if you don't try to tie back to a source material that's a popular franchise brand. And I think for companies, they're looking at it going, man, we can bring in guaranteed crowds if we call it this. But then you kind of end up with movies like Halloween 3, where, you know, you have Michael Myers chasing Jamie Lee Curtis in Halloween's 1 and 2, and then all of a sudden you make it about an evil corporation making masks that'll make people mush on Halloween. It's not a bad movie. Halloween 3 is actually not a bad movie. It just doesn't fit in the franchise. And I think we're finding a lot of that with these modern, like, requels, reboots, retellings, whatever you want to call them. They don't actually have anything to do with the original franchise, and they probably would have been better, more enjoyable movies if they had just called themselves something different and not tried to, you know, not try to be a part of that franchise. If they just let themselves be a standalone movie. That being said, I don't necessarily think that this movie was a negative. I don't necessarily think that this movie was it wasn't bad. I don't think it did anything to kind of taint or tarnish the legacy of the craft. And the way that they did this movie and the way that they were able to subvert expectations, I think was only able to be done because of the title, because of the franchise that it decided to be a part of. And I think those elements were only really successful if you were aware of the original Craft movie. I do think that it's perfectly able to be a standalone movie. I don't think that there's any issues with, you know, if you don't see the original Craft and you just watch this. I don't necessarily think there's any issues with that. And I think that's also a positive when you're talking about adding to a franchise this many years after the original. You have to let it stand alone. If it relies on your audience having seen an older movie, especially a movie that was made in the 90s, you're almost 100% going to fail, because modern moviegoers aren't going to do homework. And I think we found that with the Marvel movies. Towards the end, you know, after they did Endgame, they're finding that their movies are becoming flops, and it's because a lot of their movies require you to have seen every Marvel movie to understand what's going on. You know, they'll do references to things. And the first time that this really affected me was with Iron Man 3, because I didn't have an interest in the Avengers at all, but I really liked Iron Man. And so I saw Iron Man 1 and I loved it. And I saw Iron Man 2 and I loved it. And then I saw Iron Man 3 and I was confused as hell, because you had to have seen the Avengers before you saw Iron Man 3 in order to understand like 70% of what was going on in the movie. And I truly did not appreciate that. It really kind of soured me on the whole thing. And I think, especially when you're making horror films, you really can't demand that somebody watch a different movie before they see your current movie, unless it's a direct sequel. You know, so if you're talking about Halloween 2, Halloween 2 isn't going to make a whole lot of sense unless you've seen Halloween 1. That being said, you can watch The Craft Legacy without ever having seen The Craft, and you're still going to be able to appreciate it. That being said, I think the ending might be a little confusing if you haven't seen The Craft, but I don't think it would change the movie in any way, shape, or form. So I will give this PG-13 movie 3 stars, and I will see you tomorrow.